So what is an EAL student? It's always good to understand exactly what an EAL student is. So this is the definition that is often given. It's someone who has been learning English as a second or an additional language. It's someone who is not proficient in English as a student of the same age who has been learning only English, and they exhibit English language structures and features that are typical of those in the process of learning English. They often need assistance in classroom activities because of their stage of English language development. I think about a friend of mine whose mum came out from Italy. We have some really idioms that some people say as learners of English. So it might be shut the light instead of turn the light off. Those types of things. They could still be regarded as an EAL person because they haven't got the total structure of our English language. But for a definition purpose within some schools, what we need to be aware of is that often we're looking at a 7-year period for the student to actually learn English. And so what we want to see in that 5 to 7 years, we want to see them to be at the standard of their peers in the new language. So we often talk about the silent period being in the early years, so as they're starting to learn the language more and more. But if there still is large gaps in their understanding of the language after about 5 to 7 years, we need to further investigate as to why that occurs. Because most students in schools, because they're surrounded by English, so everything is in English, they pick up the language quite well. If they're not, then there has to be further investigation as to why. And that's when often the special needs leader needs to come and do some testing on them, or we need to take down some really good case history on them, because are they the same in their first language as well? Have they not picked up certain things in their first language like their second language? Problem with just giving them 5 to 7 years is that, of course, academic language takes a lot longer. So especially when we're talking about secondary school, the language that is used in secondary school can be quite hard for EAL learners because they don't hear it in their everyday life. So if you think about an EAL learner, they're studying in English all the time at school. Then they go home and they might be speaking another language. But the language that they're speaking at home isn't the language of school. It's the language of, and if you're talking about teenagers, how was school today? Good. What did you do? Nothing. Do you have any homework? It's that type of language, of conversational language that they have with their parents or with other people. Often it's not that academic rigor of talking about things that are happening in science or the words that are used in science or humanities or even in English and other subjects like math, in all subject areas. So we have to be really aware of that we need to give those students that language all the time. If they're not proficient in their first language, it will actually affect the development of the second language proficiency. So often what happens is that parents say, oh, I've stopped talking to them in our first language and I'm talking to them in English. Now, most of the parents who are learning English as well can speak a broken English. And so therefore, they're not really good role models for the children to actually learn English off. And what's happening is that when you actually learn a second language, you're actually looking at your first language and then transferring that information. So your second language comes in, and say, for example, you want the word chair. So you learn the word chair in English, but you can relate it back to the first language. So you're almost doing a translation in your head. If you don't have that word, then therefore it's very hard to actually develop and understand what that word is, because it has to be a whole new concept that you're looking at. So the first language is really important. And so with parents, we often tell our parents to continually keep talking to them in their first language, and that we will help them with the second language, because the first language proficiency is just so important for them to be able to transfer the knowledge that they have. As you know, when you're learning language, you're building upon it all the time. And so they need those building blocks of the first language to then layer their second language upon it. They need to have continued development, as I said, between their L1 and their L2, so between the first language and the second language. And so they can make adjustments all the time with it. And also they need time for a silent period. Now, I had a child once who arrived at the school and had a silent period for a year. Maybe a bit long, but we need to allow our students time to process what the information is that they're getting. And again, in secondary school, if they're arriving and they don't have a lot of English behind them, then it can be embarrassing for them. So there's all those other teenage things about, what do I look like in front of my friends? Am I going to look stupid when I'm saying these words? Is this the right way to do it? So we need to give them time as a silent period to actually give them time just to relax, to understand, to practice in their head how to say things, maybe to practice with somebody else before they actually can come out and say it out loud. So often we're pushing kids all the time to speak, but sometimes we just need to allow them that silent time. They also may need downtime from learning. If anyone has ever learned another language, it is very difficult and very tiring because your brain is forever trying to adapt to what is being said. And as I said before, sometimes it's a translation. So you're moving from one language to the next and trying to work out what is actually being said. So sometimes they just need a break. And so sometimes it might be that, yes, they can speak in their first language to a friend or somebody else, just so they can have that break, so it's a mental break. Or it might be that they just have to sit there and not go back to that silent period where they're just having a break, because sometimes the students are quite exhausted by exactly what's happening in the classroom. So when we're talking about EAL proficiency, in Victoria, and I'm assuming this is in other states as well, is we have the EAL pathway. And so as you can see on the slides, it's a different way of looking. So we're looking at pathway A, which is the early immersion right down the bottom. And underneath each of these headings, what happens is that there are guidelines. So if you actually go into this website, you'll see that there are guidelines as to what this looks like within each of the areas. As it's very light, which is on my left, and I'm assuming your left as well, it means that the child has very limited amounts of language. So these are students who are coming in maybe from a language school or maybe straight into your schools. They have very little proficiency in English. Then as you go through and get into the darker blues, their proficiency in English increases. And once they are deemed to be proficient, they come off this EAL pathway and into the English curriculum, whether it's the curriculum you have in your state. For a lot of students, this is quite difficult because imagine if you have a child who arrives in year 10 with no English. And so they are basically at that level CL. And then in year 11 and 12, they're supposed to come into VCE or the same equivalent within states. So they actually haven't been given the time to be able to move through these pathways. So it is difficult for the older students to actually come through this. And that's where conversations have to be had with the students and their parents about what is the best place for them. Because are they going to be able to succeed within the year 11 and 12 curriculum if they don't have the English proficiency? So this is a really good thing to have a look at or whatever your state has. I'm assuming every state does have this, and it just is the way of moving them through. And it's a way where you can actually say, okay, this is where they're at, and this is what we are going to assess them against. We're not going to assess them against the English curriculum of a year 8 or a grade 3 or a prep child. We're going to assess them against these standards because this is where they should be at. And again, if the student is not at those standards or remains in one of these standards for a long period of time, then something has to be looked at to say, all right, why is this occurring? What else is happening? Why aren't they moving forward and through these levels within a reasonable amount of time?